Well, thanks for coming, everyone. I am Ben Finholt, the Director of the Just Sentencing Project at the Wilson Center here at Duke Law. And I'm here in conversation with Preston Shipp, who is currently the Associate Policy Director for the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, but will soon be becoming the Director of
Advocacy and Policy.
Advocacy. I knew there was another word besides policy in there. Advocacy and Policy for a group called Fair and Just Prosecution. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We are here to talk about Preston's book, Confessions of a Former Prosecutor, Abandoning Vengeance and Embracing True Justice. There are copies of this book for purchase in the hallway after the event. And I will say personally that what I recommend doing in a weird twist is what I did, which was I read this book at the beach. And normally this is not what you think of, frankly, as beach reading, except weirdly it is, because when you get to the depressing parts, you can simply put the book down and stare into the infinite void of the Atlantic Ocean and contemplate our place on this planet and the many different threads of the tapestry that is humanity. And there are certainly many different threads of the tapestry of humanity in this book, I think. So I just want to start by doing a little sort of background work here. You went to law school.
I did.
Why did you go to law school?
Well, I was at a small liberal arts college in Nashville called Lipscomb University, which has just made the NCAA tournament.
Congratulations. Wow.
to the Bisons, which I think is strange because it's not right. I mean, a plural of bison is just bison, but that's not how Lipscomb sees it. But I was an American Studies major, and so I was essentially unemployable. And fortunately, my junior year, I had an internship with the Nashville Prosecutor's office. I didn't really know what the prosecutor did, but I spent a summer interning there in Davidson County, and I was in General Sessions Court working with the Victim Witness Program, so I was talking to victims, making sure that they know when to be in court and what to expect and answering any questions they had, and then showing up in court and talking to them and watching the prosecutors try cases. And I just felt like, wow, what a great career. You know, you get to put bad guys in jail, and you get to comfort victims, and you get to wear the white hat and promote public safety. And so I decided to go to law school and become a prosecutor.
So you were, like, this is your junior year of undergraduate, obviously.
Yeah,
There's no
right.
junior year of law school, but it was very explicitly prosecution from the beginning.
Thank you. I had no interest in any other kind of law. It was all criminal law. Everything else I did in law school was to pass the bar exam. And I had no desire to do anything in criminal law except be a prosecutor. It was like laser focused. This is what I'm supposed to do.
And so you graduate,
Yep.
and then what happens?
After I clerked for a judge for a couple of years because I had a law school professor tell me that was really going to be valuable experience. So I spent 2 years clerking for a criminal appellate judge, and then after that...
Was that a valuable experience?
Oh, it was, yeah, it really
Okay.
was. That was a fantastic job. The judge that I worked for he was brilliant, and he truly just a wonderful man to work for, and seeing the judicial perspective, seeing how opinions got written, and just learning. In my experience, there was so much about the system that I did not learn in the classroom, and so just learning how law is actually practiced from the judicial perspective. I had a blast, and I still am friends with that judge. But after that 2-year clerkship, then I went to work as a prosecutor in the Tennessee Attorney General's office.
Okay, and so is the attorney, so like here, the Attorney General's office in North Carolina would not be doing prosecution. They would just be doing appeals. Were you doing frontline prosecution?
It was almost exclusively appellate work.
Okay.
I did some trial work because anytime a statute is being litigated as unconstitutional, that is also an Attorney General question.
Okay.
And so I got tapped to go defend some statutes in trial court, and there were a few special cases, but for the most part it was exclusively appeals.
Okay. And so, what was your professional life like at that time?
It was, I loved it. I thought it, because it was very academic. The trial experience that I had was so, kind of felt fly by the seat of your pants. You know, you just go and you try to, it's a lot of cases and a lot of witnesses and a lot of guilty pleas, and you're just kind of always on the move. With the appellate practice, it felt there was a much slower pace. It was much more methodical and intentional. And so a typical day would be, a case would be assigned to me. There would already have been a trial or a guilty plea, a conviction, a sentence. The person appeals. And so I got the entire trial record, all the transcripts of the proceedings, all the pleadings that were filed, and a copy of the defendant's brief, whatever issues the defendant was raising. And I reviewed all that, and then I wrote the state's brief, which was, again, a very academic exercise, briefing a case. 3 days out of the month or so, I would have oral arguments in either the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals or the Tennessee Supreme Court or a federal court. So not a ton of time in the courtroom. Mostly it was in my office, researching the law, writing briefs.
And you liked it?
Loved it. Loved it. I like writing. I like studying. I like legal research. I like getting the right answer. Because
you thought you had right answers.
Always. Always. That's what makes being a prosecutor such, it's almost like a dopamine hit, you know? I mean, it's like, I'm right all the time. The person I'm arguing against is always wrong, because they're always criminals. They've always hurt someone, or stolen something, or taken a substance that they shouldn't have taken.
Allegedly.
Right. But,
although not at the time they get to you. At the time they get to you, theoretically,
At that point, yeah.
they have been proven to have done it. So it's theoretically not, although I suppose even then, a conviction is not final until it gets through you.
But that whole allegedly thing, one time when I'll fast forward a little bit, when I was teaching a college class out at a prison, and I invited a judge to be a guest speaker, and we were talking about his role, you know, as being a criminal court judge, and we were talking about the presumption of innocence. And he said, well, you know, from the moment that a criminal steps foot into my courtroom, I try to remember that, you know, they. And one of the women raised her hand and said, but he's not a criminal, and he's presumed innocent. And this is the judge.
Right.
So the deck is kind of stacked, you know, in favor of the prosecution, you know.
Yeah. And so, well, that's a perfect segue to my next question was, I know from reading the book, but you were doing other things in the rest of your life. And so one of those things, as you just noted, was teaching in prison. How did you get involved with that?
So Lipscomb University started a college prison program. And I don't know if Duke does anything like this or not.
Oh, baby. We are trying.
Yeah.
It is a bureaucratic lift of some heft.
You know, most of the time it is. For Lipscomb, it was not.
Okay.
This was really something. The guy who was my advisor while I was an undergrad had been involved in a similar program at Vanderbilt. And he decided Lipscomb needed to be offering college classes out at one of the Tennessee prisons. And he knew I was a prosecutor, so he thought, you know, I'm going to ask Preston about this. So he takes me to coffee one day in the spring of 2006. And he says, I think we should do a college class out of the prison. And I just thought that was wonderful. It just seemed like such a neat opportunity. I want people to, you know, be rehabilitated, you know. I mean, even though I was arguing they need to go to prison, I don't want them to just waste away. And I thought, man, a college class out of prison, that's great. And so we immediately reached out to the Lipscomb folks and to the Tennessee Department of Correction. And it was less than a year later. So, I mean, we had coffee in the spring of 2006. It was probably March. And January 27, 2007 is when we offered our first class. So, I mean, the red tape just somehow evaporated. But yeah, that's one of the things that I was doing that caused me to rethink.
Yeah, and so what were the classes? What were you teaching? What was that like?
So Richard Good was the guy's name who directed the program. And he wanted the very first class to be judicial process. Because what he was going to do is he was going to have 15 women who lived at the Tennessee Prison for Women, enrolled as Lipscomb students, earning college credit, and he was going to have 15 traditional undergrads go to the prison to take classes alongside the women at the prison. So 30 people, 15 insiders, 15 outsiders, and he thought, we need to talk about judicial process, because that judicial process is what separates us. Half of us have been through it, half of us don't even know what it is, so let's talk about it. So that, and he asked me to teach that class.
And what was, I mean, your experience there, like what, I mean, I used to teach high school math, and I know what that's like, but teaching in a prison setting with the model I've heard, it's inside out, because you have people from inside and people from outside mixing. What is that like?
Yeah, so it was my first time to teach a college class, so I was nervous about that. The outside students were, of course, nervous because they'd never been to a prison before. Mm-hmm. They had never been through a security checkpoint, where they got patted down, and they had never seen, some had never seen a prison with the fences and the gates and the razor wire, and it's very intimidating. We had one kid who never got out of his car. He pulled into the parking lot for the first class. He surveyed he saw it all, and he just went back to campus. And so I failed his ass.
No, I didn't. You couldn't drop. This is a no-drop class. As soon as you hit the parking lot, you're in.
No, he made it back the second week, and he was okay. But then you had the women, the women at the prison. Most of them, maybe all of them, this was their first college class. Mm-hmm. For a lot of them, they were the first person in their family to attend a college class. Mm-hmm. A number of them had not graduated high school; they just gotten their GED. And so they were really intimidated by these professional college students coming out, and it's like, well, am I going to be able to perform? Do I know how to write a paper? Or are these kids going to run circles around me and make me look stupid? And so everybody was really nervous. But it turns out that talking about judicial process was really just sort of like the picture frame. We could have been talking about literature or chemistry or anything else. The real point was having that proximity between people who live in a prison and people who don't, and have them come together and find out that they're pretty much the same, and become friends. That was what was really striking.
That happened.
100%, yeah. It was a 4-hour class. We met on Wednesday nights.
Okay.
And we would go from 5:30 to 9:30. And so I would teach for about 2 hours. And then, I kid you not, we would take at least a 45-minute break, just so they could talk. It became very clear that 45 minutes was why we were there. And we could talk about judicial process, that's great. I like to talk about it. We had great conversations. But that 45-minute break, where they were talking about what movies they like, what books they're reading, their families, that it was like reconciliation, It was the people on the inside were finding out that they're not bad. That they have friends on the outside who value them and don't see them as, Tennessee Department of Correction inmate numbers. And the kids on the outside are finding out, these are people who killed people, Several of them were serving life without parole for killing somebody. Yet, this is my friend, and they started exchanging contact information so they could write letters. So that was the genius of the program.
Yeah. And what about for you? What was changing for you? Well, I won't say if anything, because that is after all the point.
So that was the first time that I had been in a room with people who were incarcerated. That was not a courtroom. And where we just put our chairs in a circle, and the rules of evidence do not apply, so it's not like there's certain things I'm not going to get to hear. They told me whatever they wanted to tell me. And I started hearing about the context. As they opened up, they shared details about why they were there. And I started hearing the human context in which they had done the things that they had done. And several themes emerged among those 15 people. I mean, they were all victims of prior trauma, abuse, neglect. Most of them were first-time offenders. I think that I had sort of assumed that by the time you get a long prison sentence, you've had chance after chance after chance, and that's not true. Most of them had been poor. Most of them had suffered from some sort of a mental health issue that had gone undiagnosed or untreated, and most of them had self-medicated. And for some of them, that's why they were there, was just for a drug charge. But several of them, the addiction issues, the substance abuse had sort of spiraled with the trauma and the abuse, and several of them had killed their abuser or their trafficker. And in Tennessee, if you kill someone, if it's first degree murder, it's a 51-year sentence. So we had people who were victims themselves, who when they finally drew a line in the sand and say, I will not be victimized again, they got hit with a 51-year sentence. And that was, for me, the adversarial system does such a good job of keeping people siloed, where prosecutors don't have the opportunity to hear from the people who are charged with crimes. We don't hear the full human context, and that's what makes it so easy to pass judgment on. Because how else am I going to argue that somebody who I don't even know needs to spend 15 years in prison? I mean, what a thing to say about someone you don't know. And it's because there's not an opportunity for me to care about that person. And so that proximity, hearing their stories, finding out that they are profoundly gifted people, good people, who had been in terrible situations in which I would not probably have acted any differently than they did. All of a sudden, the judgment kind of goes away, and my compassion starts to increase. And I started wondering, well, what about these other hundreds of cases that I've worked on? If I had a chance to put my chair in a circle with those people, would I care about them? Would I have been comfortable writing that brief, saying, yeah, they need to go spend 5 years in prison, which 5 years is nothing.
Yeah.
5 years is nothing
In the system. Yeah.
We give out 5 years like candy. And it's like 5 years of someone's life, 5 Christmases you take away from somebody. Yeah. It's like, how in the world can I, in good conscience, go argue that, after I've sat in this circle? So it was causing me a tremendous amount of conflict and angst, the deeper I got into it.
Yeah, and this is something, I mean, again, as a former teacher that I thought about while I was reading about you talking about teaching is, I just wondered to what extent, I was always rooting for my students to get it, I taught high school math, and so it's like when you're doing geometry, you want people to understand parallel lines, and then when they do, you feel great about it. And it strikes me that you probably had some of those same feelings of I really hope you get what I'm laying down, and then when they do, you're all very proud of this person. To what extent, because I know I had this, even though everyone says you don't, did you have favorites within the classroom?
Yeah, I did. I think it's just the people that I saw who were just so enthusiastic about, not necessarily about judicial process, but just about learning.
Yeah.
Who just recognized, and undergrads, for the most part, don't. Traditional undergrads, they go to class all day, every day. If there's something that they decide to tune in for, great. If they decide to kind of coast for a day, they can always come back the next day and be plugged in, because that's what they do. They go to class. But for those 15 college inside students, this was like the highlight of their week. This is when they weren't going to be bullied. They were going to feel safe. They were going to feel seen and valued. They were going to be listened to. So it became very clear to me that even though I was needing to teach them what a preliminary hearing is and stuff, I needed to make sure that it was an open discussion. So I almost never lectured, because instead I wanted to ask questions. Because nobody ever asks prisoners questions. Yeah. Nobody ever asks them what they think about anything. And so to have somebody come in and yield the floor and say, I want you to, if you raise your hand, you have the floor for as long as you want. You get to tell us what you think about whatever. Another thing that I did, I know I'm straying from your question just a little bit, but I knew we were only meeting once a week, and I wanted it so much to be like a dialogue, that what I had them do was, after we would have class on Wednesday nights, they would go and they would write in a blue book, a 500-word reflection on anything we talked about, anything in their assigned readings. They could write 500 words about anything they wanted to. Then they would bring their blue book to the next class and exchange with somebody. And that person would then read their 500 words and write a reaction of 250 words. And then they would bring that back to class and I would get it. And then I would write my own reaction. And then I would give it back to the original student. So that, for 3 weeks, we were sort of in dialogue together. And again, I think that was just so sort of empowering, especially for the inside students, because what they were getting back in the responses were, wow, I never thought about that. Or I didn't pick up on that part of the reading, but that's really interesting, or whatever, just validating that perspective. And of course, the outside students were just getting to hear what it's like being locked up, And so, the education that was happening for everybody, and it was like academics at its absolute best.
I mean, it's funny, it strikes me, first of all, that you were better at teaching than I was, which is nice to feel in this moment about my past self and your past self. But that's an incredibly generous way to run a classroom. And part of it is I was definitely not that generous. I definitely did a lot of lecturing at high school students about parallel lines, Why do you think, what was it, do you think, about you or your background or your makeup that made you be so generous about the way you ran the classroom?
I think if you're familiar with the Enneagram, I think I show a lot of characteristics of an 8 on the Enneagram.
Okay.
Which the 8 is sort of a challenger. The 8 doesn't mind a little confrontation. The 8 feels fairly confident in their positions and is okay arguing for them. And I think that I was just aware back then, even though I wasn't super familiar with the Enneagram, but I was still self-aware enough to recognize some of those tendencies. And I was like, I've got to make sure that I don't boss anybody around in this space, because that would just be sort of...
Yeah, but I guess that's my question. Most people don't have that. What was it about you that made you so... Was there a particular thing in your background or something that made you so self-aware?
Probably my wife.
Okay.
My wife probably helped me think through, okay, you're going to teach a college class. Here's the mistakes you're probably going to make.
Here are the mistakes you're making with me. Please don't make them with these people.
Here's how I feel around you. Please don't make other people feel that way.
Totally.
So yeah, she her name is Charisse, and she was always a very, very helpful sounding board. If you're into the Enneagram, she's a 2. Which is someone who likes to address other people's needs. And so she's super sensitive.
Yeah.
And so she perceived, I think, in that moment that I didn't know how to teach a college class, especially not in a prison. And so she was able to sort of help me think through, okay, you're going to have people who are very intimidated on both sides. The college kids and the inmates are going to be intimidated. So you're going to have to figure out a way to foster open sharing. And some people are not going to be willing to raise their hands. But if you make them write a 500-word journal entry, and then, of course, when they brought it to class, if it was like one that was really good, and there always, of course, were, but like something that I was like, ooh, that's really good, I'd read it. I'd ask them beforehand, do you mind if I read from your journal? And of course, they would say, yeah, even the shyest would be like, oh, yeah, it's like, he thinks it's good, And so I would say, I want y'all to get this, listen to what this person had to say. And that's just so affirming, again, they're told all day, every day, everything about the prison system is trying to diminish them and dehumanize them. And so for anybody to come along and say, ooh, you're really smart. What you just said is really important and other people need to hear it. It's like all of a sudden their sense of self just is so enhanced. And that created such a vibrant, then people wanted to be more open. well, now I'm gonna share more, you know, I'm not gonna be so guarded, you know, maybe I will raise my hand next time, you know, so yeah, really, it was, but I don't wanna take credit for it, because I just think there was more going on, you know? There was more going on than me or anybody, it was just kind of one of those really profound things where just like everything belonged, you know?
Mhm. So let's, you know, I mean, again, I'm gonna ask this like I don't exactly know the answer, but, you know, to what extent did your, you know, time as a prosecutor intersect with the classroom teaching?
So I started teaching in the college program in the spring of 2007. And I went into that class fully and I was still just a very zealous prosecutor. And it was almost immediate. I got into that classroom and I started feeling like a phony. I started thinking that there's a lack of authenticity in my job and my vocation and my Monday through Friday self. It felt like such a betrayal, because Wednesday nights when I was teaching, it's like that was right, that was true, that was like gospel, and everything else was fake, you know. And it's like, how am I going to write one more brief? But by that time, I had 2 daughters, and Sharice was staying home. And it's like, you can't, you know. I went to law school to be a prosecutor, you know. I couldn't just switch and become a personal injury attorney. I would have committed malpractice. I didn't know what to do. I felt very trapped. And so I continued on as a prosecutor. I finally was able to figure out a different thing to do at the end of 2008.
Okay.
So it was about 2 years of really, really a lot of self-loathing and sleepless nights.
And what did you go do?
A friend of mine was working for the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility, which is the lawyer ethics board. And he and I had talked a little bit, and he was like, well, you're not going to be saving the world necessarily, but you can come work for the ethics board and you won't be sending people to prison. And I was like, done.
And was that sort of the last you heard of your former prosecutorial life?
Yeah, because the friends that I had made in that world were still very invested in it, and they thought that I had completely lost my mind.
Mm.
They knew how driven I was. They knew that I saw myself. You know, some people become a prosecutor, and then they'll go become a defense attorney.
Yeah.
Or they'll become a prosecutor, and then they'll go do another kind of law, or they, you know, one ran for office and is now the majority leader in Tennessee. You know, so I mean, people will do it for different reasons. Everybody knew that I just wanted to be a prosecutor. And so they thought that I had just completely gone off the deep end. And for the most part, that was just a clean break. You know?
And were you able to sort of explain?
Not in terms they could understand, because they had not been in that classroom.
Yeah. And so, you know, getting to sort of, there's almost like a twist here in the book, right, about a particularly hard-hitting moment for you. And, you know, I mean, I don't want to spoil the book, but if you could just give a little bit of sort of what that moment was like for you and how that made things shift even harder.
Yeah. Well, I don't mind spoiling the book, because people aren't, you know, you may not read it anyway, so you may as well get the gist. So I had a student in class who, she was one of the favorites, you know. She was so excited about being a college student, and she was so bright, and she wanted to do extra reading. She was one of those who would say, what else could I read, you know, in this vein. And then she had stuff that she wanted me to read, because we had some similar interests, and so she would loan me books. And she was real sarcastic, which I really appreciated. And so I found out about her backstory, and it just made me even more sympathetic to her. She has been 16 years old. She was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, which you know, right away she had brain damage to her frontal lobe. which interferes with your decision-making ability and appreciating the risks and consequences of your conduct. Her mother was a drug addict who abandoned her when she was 2. Terrible, terrible life. She ran away from her adopted mother when she was 16 and was living on the streets, which of course means she's very vulnerable for sex trafficking. A trafficker finds her and exploits her, rapes her, abuses her, gets her hooked on drugs. Just terrible, terrible situation. At 16, she gets picked up by this guy who was 43. He takes her back to his house, and it freaks her out. He starts showing her all these guns that he had collected and stuff, and she is convinced that he's going to kill her. And her trafficker had given her a little revolver for protection, and so while the guy had his back turned, she went into her purse, got the pistol, and shot him in the back of the head. And so in Tennessee, that's first-degree murder. And she's 16, she goes to juvenile court, she's immediately waived to adult court because whatever is supposed to happen at a transfer hearing, if it's first-degree murder, it's going to be transferred. And so she goes to court, she gets tried as an adult, found guilty, and she gets 51 years. And so I had this girl in class, and you just think about, what in the world causes us to think that what that girl needed was 51 years in prison. It just put like a fine point on everything I had learned, up to that point in my journey about how broken the system is. And about halfway through the semester, this girl's name was Cyntoia Brown, and about halfway through the semester, I went to my mailbox. I had left the Attorney General's office by that time, but it had only been like 3 months. And so I was still getting opinions from the Court of Criminal Appeals because, the appeals courts take so slow to issue opinions. And so I went to my mailbox. There was an opinion from the Court of Criminal Appeals. And so I'm curious to see what they had done, what case it was. I open it up, and it's Cyntoia Brown's opinion. And it dawned on me that, oh man, I had that case. That was a case that I had. And as the realization that washed over me that this was the girl in my class, I thought, my goodness, look what the system does to us. It is so dehumanizing that I didn't even notice her name on my class roster. The idea that I would ever actually meet someone whose case I had worked on, it was never even a possibility in my imagination. And so it's kind of like one of those things where if you're not looking for it, you don't see it. And I had argued that, 16 years old, she was properly tried as an adult, she was properly convicted and sentenced to 51 years, and I knew she was going to get her own copy of the opinion and see my name on it. And I had that to look forward to for our next class discussion. Was trying to figure out, how do I go tell this girl, I'm sorry for having a hand in your 51-year life sentence. But I mean, that's what there's always that potential, I guess, for people to recognize the ways that we treat each other as less than fully human. It's just that potential is so seldom realized. And in our case it was. And we had to figure out, well, how do we relate to each other as human beings now? That we've been pitted against each other and we wore these labels. How can we have a reconciled relationship? And so that became the task that semester, was to try to piece that together and figure out how can I be Cyntoia's friend? How can she forgive me for the things I said about her in court before I even knew who she was?
And how did they go?
No, not well, not well at first. She was very gracious to me. She said everything that she could have said. She said, you were doing your job. You didn't know me. I quit my job by that time. She was like, you recognized that you didn't need to be in that position, so you quit. But I mean, it didn't make it any better. I mean, it was still like this terrible wound, that had been reopened for her. And so we did have the sense that we were not going to get this figured out on Wednesday nights, and so we did start writing letters. And in the first letter I got from her, which I found a few years ago, I kind of squirreled it away, but the first letter I got from her, she said that I was going to have to find ways to try to make that money. She said, now that you know what you know, you're going to have to find other kids and try to make things better for them. So she kind of gave me some marching orders.
Yeah, I mean that, and you took those marching orders very seriously. How long did it take until you started working at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth?
That happened about longer than that. So Cyntoia and I were together, we had class in 2009. So it was 10 years later. It took 10 years for me to find my way into doing this work full time.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit, about that work? What was your role? I mean, for another week,
Right.
Still is your role at the campaign.
So my job at the CFSY has been, I lead their legislative advocacy work, which means that we exist. Brian Stevenson and others founded the CFSY to end life without parole for children. The United States is the only country in the world that will condemn a child to die in prison. And so the CFSY goes from state to state, meeting with lawmakers and advocates and trying to convince state legislators to pass laws ending life without parole for kids.
And that's been your role for 6 years.
About 6 years, yeah. 28 states have now ended life without parole for children. North Carolina still has it. North Carolina will still sentence children to die in prison. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done here, and especially in the South. It's curious, that the area where you can't throw a rock without hitting a church building is the one that's holding on so tightly to things like the death penalty and sending children to prison for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and Preston has been part of campaigns here. We got as close to having a committee meeting about it that then didn't go forward. And so you are now making a switch to fair and just prosecution. What's your role going to be there?
In some ways, I think it'll be very similar to what I've done at the campaign. It'll just be working on a broader range of issues. Fair and just prosecution, what they try to do is educate and equip and inspire and support prosecutors who are willing to see themselves as agents of change. So often, prosecutors want to defend the system. And if you can get them to kind of flip a switch and see them as having the potential to really reform the system, they can be powerful advocates and change agents. Everywhere I go, lawmakers want to know what their prosecutor has to say about ending life without parole for kids. And so not only can the prosecutor implement whatever changes they want to make in their own jurisdiction, they can also influence state lawmakers to pass bills. Certainly as it pertains to life without parole for kids, but also as it pertains to many, many other criminal justice reform issues.
So, you talked earlier about how much you learned when you were doing your judicial internship. What are they? Clerkship. Yeah, that's what they call it. and about how there was stuff you didn't learn in law school. Mm-hmm. What do you if you were one of these many students? Sort of what advice do you have in terms of you've got some time in law school left? What could they be learning? What could they be thinking about that you think would be helpful in terms of thinking about the way the criminal legal system works?
I think, there's a few things. I think in the Tennessee rules of professional conduct, we have a preamble. And the preamble, of course, it's not part of the rules necessarily. You can't be disciplined for violating the preamble. It's just aspirational. But it does talk about the unique role that lawyers play within our society. And it talks a lot about serving poor, vulnerable people. And I feel like I didn't learn that in law school. Even in our professional responsibility class, we didn't talk about the preamble. But I feel like, my goodness, that's important. It's important, because you go to law school, and a law degree is just a tool, it's like anything else. There's nothing magic about having a JD. If you don't need it to do what you want to do, this is not a good way to spend 3 years and tens of thousands of dollars. It's just a tool, so you need to know what you want to do with it, So I think we need to have in mind, I, of course, could not have anticipated the twists and turns my career took. Probably none of us can. But you do need to have in mind why you're getting a law degree. And it needs to be something better than, I want to make money. Because there's easier ways to make money than practicing law. You need to think about that. I don't know if North Carolina has a preamble like that. But thinking about using your skills and your education as a lawyer to make things better. Again, I think about prosecutors, so often they just settle for defending the status quo. And the status quo is terrible. It's just terrible. When you will take a 16-year-old child who has been victimized from the time she was like in utero, and the best thing you can think of to do for her is give her a 51-year life sentence. That is a effed up system that needs some reform. And if prosecutors could see themselves as agents of changing that system, and if lawyers were committed to using their law degree as a tool to affect change for other similarly situated 16-year-old kids, we're all going to be better off. And so I tell this to my own kids. I've got a 20-year-old daughter who's a junior in college and an 18-year-old who's going into college next year. I said, it doesn't matter what you want to study, but you need to figure out how to use it in service to other people. And you don't need to be able to predict what's coming 5 years down the pike. Nobody can. But just have in mind that is your guiding light. I want to serve. My middle daughter wants to be an interior decorator. I don't know how interior decorators can make life better for poor people, but she's going to need to figure that out. That's going to be part of what she does, is try to figure out, okay, she's super passionate about it. It's weird, but she has been this way since she was tiny. We would get her a Barbie dream house, and she would use none of the furniture or decoration. She wanted to go to like Joann's and buy fabrics and stuff and decorate it herself. When she was teeny tiny, and when she figured out that you could be an interior designer, she was like, that's what I've always wanted to do. I just didn't know it. And so being a lawyer, being an interior designer, whatever it is, figure out how you can use it to serve people. And then try to get out of the way. That's something else that I think, a lesson that I learned, is that I never, ever, ever could have manufactured any of this for myself. I couldn't have grabbed the bull by the horns and worked it out to go do the work that I've done the past 6 years. But I feel like I've sort of been in a current, and I talk about that in the book. And I think everybody can trust that current, and if you try not to swim against it, and if you keep your eyes open and try not to miss anything good that comes along the way, it will take you where you need to go.
All right, so I got one more question, and then I'm going to see what other questions people have. All right, so let's say that we put you in charge of the criminal legal system, let's just say of North Carolina. What happens when, how would society respond when one person causes harm to another person? Mm-hmm. Either property harm, physical harm. What would we do? What would that system look like in an ideal world for you?
I think I've learned so much about stuff like that from people who have been directly touched by violence either because they have caused harm themselves, or they have suffered it, or they've had a loved one suffer. So I think about Ms. Nichols. I've seen and read and heard her talk about how her feeling was not, I have suffered, therefore someone else needs to suffer. You know, Ms. Nichols, when she writes and speaks, it's always centered in addressing harm through healing. What are we going to need to do to bring about healing? Which is a totally different paradigm from what we have. We have a paradigm that is based on sort of a spirit of institutionalized vengeance. We think that justice is tantamount to punishment. And we think that if I'm concerned about victims and public safety on one hand, that means I cannot be concerned about the well-being of the people who cause harm, because in our minds, justice is a zero-sum game. And so I would say we can't just tinker with that. We need to scrap that. That is a broken paradigm. And instead, we need something that is more rooting in addressing the needs of the people who suffer, as well as the Cyntoias of this world. You know, it's not like Cyntoia didn't do something wrong. I mean, she shot a man in the back of the head. That man had family and friends. But Cyntoia recognizes that. It's not like she feels like she got away with something when the governor granted her clemency after 15 years. But she didn't need to serve 51. That little girl needed help. And a lot of these folks need help. And so if I were in charge, I don't know exactly what all the processes would look like to get us there, but it would be a paradigm that recognizes that we need to center the needs of the people who suffer, as well as address the needs of the people who cause harm. And that is not going to take place in an adversarial system where all we seek to do is compound the harm.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for being here. Nice to see you again. I can't help but think about, especially in that last half, a lot of the language you use, you sound like some of us public defenders, and when you talked about your experience teaching in the prison, you kind of confirmed what a lot of public defenders and folks in the community, kind of their suspicions, right? That if you could get someone to understand the humanity behind every single person, we would lower this desire for vengeance, we would lower the punitive nature of it, and potentially some of the harm and punishment that prosecutors sought. Do you think, and I have to think that it wasn't for lack of trying, do you think there's anything someone could have said to you while you were still a prosecutor, while you were in court every day, that could have helped you see that before having the experience of being in close proximity, before, nothing obviously substitutes for getting to know someone, spending 4 hours a week with them, but, from the, as someone who's going to try to practice and be in a courtroom every day and may only have 5 minutes with you, what could someone have said to you at that point that may have, gotten you to explore that humanity a little closer?
Well, you're right. There is no substitute for proximity. It makes all the difference in the world. And I don't know that there was anything that somebody could have said that would have spun me like a top the way that Time Out at the women's prison did. But I feel like if there was going to be something, it would have been hearing more about the human context in which certain crimes are committed, hearing about the success that people have when they come home and the good things that they do. And as well as maybe just ask me to use my imagination a little more and not shut down my capacity for compassion. So for example, I had a case when I was a prosecutor of a little boy who he got in trouble with his mom's boyfriend. And this little boy, I think, was 8 years old. And the boyfriend made him stand with his nose against a wall, holding a can of like corn or peas or something in each hand out straight, which is, and he taped them to his hands and made him hold his hands out straight, which is a stress position. And they estimated the little boy was in that position for about half an hour. And he was shaking, trying to hold it, and he shook one of the cans free. and he reached down in a fit of anger and picked up and threw it at the boyfriend. And the boyfriend then went over and grabbed the kid behind the neck and punched him in the stomach. And the next day, the kid was constantly complaining for a while about abdominal pain. And the next day, he was complaining about how thirsty he was. He could not drink enough. And the next day, he died because the guy hit him so hard that it ruptured his internal organs. And so the contents of he was bleeding and everything, and so he was so thirsty, and then he died. And the boyfriend was charged with first-degree murder. And that was one of those cases as a prosecutor where I felt like, boy, there's not a sentence long enough for that guy, you know, to hurt a child like that, to put that kid through that for 48 hours. And that's where prosecutors live. And that's a very comfortable place to live, is that you hurt a vulnerable child and you're gonna pay. And I can do that, and I can go home and I can sleep perfectly well. Until I ask myself, what if that little boy had not died? What if he had continued to be abused, and he'd grown up continuing to be abused and abused and abused, and then he gets to be in his early 20s, and he has a girlfriend with a son, and he punches that little boy. At that point, I still feel compassion for that kid, because I know why he did that, because he lived that. When you sustain violence and trauma, when you suffer, when you deal with the psychological, emotional effects of trauma for that long, and then you finally resort to violence yourself, what the hell else do we expect? If that kid had lived and turned into an abuser himself, what else do we expect? And I feel compassion for him. Well, now I can think about the boyfriend in the first instance and think, what did he live through that brought him to that point? And now I'm not so ready to say that he's disposable. You know, now I've expanded the perimeter of my sense of concern and compassion to include even someone who hit a child, because I don't know what he lived through as a child. And if I heard his full story, I might feel for the guy, even though he did a terrible thing. You know, he did a terrible thing, and you can't minimize the hurt. But at the same time, if we recognize that that guy probably didn't just make a decision, I'm going to kill a kid. You know, I've got a friend at the front, because I still go out to the prison. I've got a friend who read my book, and he had never told me his story until he read my book. And he said, he wrote me a letter afterwards, and he thanked me for it. And he said that it gave him a lot of comfort, because he shook a baby, a newborn baby, and the baby died. And he said, I've never thought that anybody could see past that. So I never talk about that. I've never told anybody about that until I read your book. And he asked me if I would still, be his friend. You know, knowing that about him. Probably expecting me to be like, I'm not writing this guy back. And there's no way that I could have anticipated when I went to work for the AG's office that one of these days I was going to be, I know a guy, I've got a friend who was a school shooter. He killed 4 people. It's like, I couldn't have planned that, man. You know, you're not anticipating that when you declare your major. But you don't know when you start to allow your sense of compassion to expand, who it's going to be called upon to include, you know. Hearing those stories, even if I hadn't gotten to know them personally, if I had heard about the context in which some of these crimes were committed, and what the people had dealt with previous to that, and what they've gone on to do, I think storytelling is where we can start to make a dent, even in some really, really tough people.
Yeah.
I think we're currently living through the sort of revival of law and order discourse. We hear it a lot in the news. This morning, President Trump said that Joe Biden's pardons were void and null. I don't think that's legal. I'm not a lawyer, but what do I know? And here in North Carolina, we had a law to raise the age, and now has been rolled back. So we're seeing a lot of defeats and failures, and I think things that are hard to keep going in the face of. And so I'm curious what your advice to students and us as people who work in the space would be. How do you sort of maintain resilience in the face of defeat and of bad news and things like that?
Well, and we're on the way over here. We were talking about how we're in a tough moment, and it feels like it's been a sequential, tough moment after tough moment after tough moment for a long time now. And I think for me personally, it is tempting to be discouraged when you feel ineffective. But I'm not sure we're called all the time to be effective. I think sometimes we're just called to be faithful. And if we're being faithful, then we celebrate every single good story. And I feel like I'm leaving the CFSY at a profoundly difficult moment. And I'm not exactly sure what I would be doing if I were staying to try to be effective, be more effective, and I don't know what they're going to do with me being gone, how they're going to try to strategize to be more effective. But I know that there are now over 1,100 people home who were told as children that they were going to die in prison. And a handful of them are in North Carolina. And we celebrate that. We celebrate that. The bottom line is, if all of a sudden the CFSY met with unprecedented success and got bills passed in all 50 states, and now life without parole is no longer a thing for kids, and we've fulfilled our mission, that's just a drop in the bucket, man. I mean, because LWOP sentences, JLWOP sentences, that's a drop in the bucket when you think about what we're up against. And so that can't be the focus. You do what you can where you are, and continue to be faithful to what you feel like your vocation is. And that's, you talk about the different threads in the book. That's one that I wanted to, not everybody's a criminal lawyer, right? But I hope that they at least pick up on the idea of a vocation and being true to your vocation, whatever it is, even if it's Ruby wanting to be an interior decorator. You just got to be faithful to what you feel like you're called to, and not get bogged down when you're going through a time of feeling like you're not terribly effective.
Well, we are at time. Thank you, Preston.